So let us now tackle the fraud risk management program. So formal documents should provide for the design and implementation of a comprehensive and coordinated approach to fraud control. While most organizations have rules, rules relating to theft, fraud, and corruption in their code of conduct, not all have outlined the complete range of subjects necessary for an effective fraud risk management program. It is the organization's prerogative with oversight from the board to determine the type and format of documentation it wishes to adopt for its fraud risk management program. So, the suggested formats include first, a single comprehensive and complete document addressing in detail all aspects of fraud controls. A brief strategy outline emphasizing the attributes of fraud control but leaving the design of specific policies and procedures to those responsible for business functions within the organization. A compilation of plans developed by divisions or subsidiaries, while each organization needs to consider its size and complexity when determining what type of formal documentation is most appropriate. Best practice is to have a formal fraud control policy that discusses the practices that fall into each of the causal elements. The document should at least reference the elements detailed below. So first in line is the organization's commitment to fraud prevention, detection, and correction or deterrence. The elements of an effective policy on fraud and availability of fraud awareness training. The roles and responsibilities for fraud prevention, detection, and deterrence. Conflicts of interest or code of conduct or other ethics and compliance policies, affirmation process and disclosure process, the fraud risk assessment and control planning, the reporting procedures, the investigation process, discipline and remediation, process evaluation, improvement quality assurance, and lastly, maintenance. So after all, the fraud risk governance or the fraud being detected or the fraud being there, let us move on to the fraud risk assessment. So regulators, professional standard setters, and law enforcement authorities have emphasized the crucial role of fraud risk assessment plays in developing and maintaining effective anti-fraud programs and controls. Organizations can identify and assess fraud and misconduct risks in conjunction with an overall enterprise risk assessment or on a standalone basis. So, organizations can tailor this approach to meet their individual needs, complexities, and goals. Fraud, by definition, entails intentional misconduct designed to evade detection. As such, the fraud risk assessment team should engage in strategic reasoning to predict the behavior of a potential fraud perpetrator. So, strategic reasoning requires a skeptical mindset and involves asking questions such as how might a fraud perpetrator exploit weaknesses in the system controls? How could perpetrator override or circumvent controls? And lastly, what could a perpetrator do to conceal the risk of fraud? So, a fraud and misconduct risk assessment generally includes three elements. First is to identify inherent fraud risk, which is gathering information to obtain the population of fraud risks that could apply to your organization. Included in this process is the explicit consideration of all types of fraud, incentives, pressures, and opportunities to commit fraud and IT fraud risks specific to your organization. Next is to assess likelihood and significance of inherent fraud risks. So, assessing the relative likelihood and potential significance of identified fraud risks based on historical information, known fraud schemes, and interviews with business process owners. Lastly, is to respond to reasonably likely and significant inherent and residual fraud risks. So, in deciding what the response should be to address the identified risks, performing a cost benefit analysis of fraud risk over which the organization wants to implement controls or specific fraud detection procedures. Organizations should apply a framework to their document or to document their fraud risk assessment, beginning with a list of identified fraud schemes, which are then assessed for relative significance and likelihood of occurrence. The team should then map the risk to relevant controls, which are evaluated for design effectiveness and tested to validate operating effectiveness. Next is the organization should develop a response to residual fraud risk. So, the following is the framework that illustrates how the elements of fraud risk identification, assessment, and response are applied in a rational, structured approach. So, the risk management cycle is an interactive process of identifying risks, assessing their impact, and prioritizing actions to control and reduce a risk. So, a number of iterative steps should be taken. First step is to establish a risk management group and set goals. Second step is to identify risk areas. Third step is to understand and assess the scale of risk. Fourth step is to develop a risk response strategy. Fifth step is to implement the strategy and allocate responsibilities. Sixth step is to implement and monitor the suggested controls. And seventh step is review and refine the process and do it again. So, on the next slide, we will be furtherly discussing what are these steps or what are the doings in each steps. And then finally, let us discuss the risk management cycle. So, the very first step is to establish a management group and set goals. So, a risk management group should be established whose task is to facilitate and coordinate the overall risk management process. Possible members of the group could include a chief risk officer, a non-executive director, finance director, internal auditor, and heads of planning and sales, treasurer, and operational staff, depending on the size and nature of the organization. The risk management group may be in the form of a committee who meet from time to time. So, the risk management group will promote the understanding and assessment of risk and facilitate the development of a strategy for dealing the risk identified. They may also be responsible for conducting reviews of systems and procedure to identify and assess risks faced by the business, which include the risk of fraud and introducing the controls that are best suited to the business unit. However, line manager and their staff may also be involved in the risk identification and assessment process, with the risk management group providing guidance. So, after establishing a group, the next step is to identify risk areas, which is each risk in the overall risk model should be explored to identify how it potentially evolves through the organization. It is important to ensure that the risk is carefully defined and explained to facilitate further analysis. The techniques of analysis include workshops and reviews, brainstorming, questionnaires, process mapping, comparisons with other organizations, discussion with peers. So after the second step is next step is to understand and assess the skill, as we see in the table showing in the slide, which is from establishing to identify to understand and assess the scale of risk. So under this third step, this step also include the analyzation of the scale risk, or yeah, this also includes the analyzation, which I will be tackling later. So um, understand and assess the scale of risk. So once risks have been identified, an assessment of possible impact and corresponding likelihood of occurrence should be made using consistent parameters that will enable the development of prioritized risk analysis. So in the planning stage, management should agree on the most appropriate definition and number of categories to be used when assessing both likelihood and impact. The assessment of the impact of the risk should not simply take account of the financial impact, but should also consider the organization's viability and reputation, and recognize the political and commercial sensitivities involved. The analysis should either be qualitative or quantitative and should be consistent to allow comparisons. So, the qualitative approach usually involves grading risks in high, medium, and low categories. Impact, the assessment of potential impact of a particular risk, may be complicated by the fact that the range of possible outcomes may exist, or that the risk may occur a number of times in a given period of time, of course. So, such complications should be anticipated and a consistent approach adapted, which is, for example, may seek to estimate a worst case scenario, or the like. So, the likelihood of occurrence of risk occurring should be assessed on a gross, a net, and a target basis. So under this step, there should be analyzation of risk fraud, or analyzing the fraud risks. So so fraud risk is um, fraud risk is one component of operational risk, which is operational risk focuses on the risk associated with errors or events in transaction processing or other business operations. A fraud risk review considers whether this error or events could be the result of a deliberate act designed to benefit the perpetrator. So, as a result, fraud risk reviews should be detailed exercise conducted by teams combining in depth knowledge of the business and market with detailed knowledge and experience of fraud. Risks such as false accounting or the theft of cash or assets need to be considered for each part of the organization's business. So frequently, um, businesses focuses on a number of limited risks, most commonly on third party thefts. So to avoid this, the risk should be classified by reference to the possible type of offense and the potential perpetrators. Fraud risk need to be assessed for each area and process of business. For example, the cash or expenses and the likes. So after the understanding, which is after the understanding, under the understanding stage or step, next is to develop a risk response strategy. So the next step is to develop a risk response strategy. So, once these risks has been identified and assessed, strategies to deal with each risk identified can be developed by line management with guidance from the risk management group. So, strategies for responding to risk generally fall into one of the following. First is the risk retention, the risk avoidance, the risk reduction, mm, the um, risk reduction, and the likes. So, before the strategies are developed, it is necessary to establish the risk appetite of the organization. So, when we say risk appetite, it is the level of risk that the organization is prepared to accept, and this should be determined by the board. So, the appetite for risk will influence the strategies to be developed for managing risk. It is worth noting that the board's risk appetite may vary for different types of risk and over time. So, so after the development of after the after developing a risk response strategy, next is to implement the strategy and allocate responsibilities. So in implementing or the chosen strategies should be allocated and communicated to those responsible for implementation. So, for the plan to be effective, it is essential that responsibility for each specific action is assigned to the appropriate operational manager and that clear target dates are established for each action. It is also important to obtain the cooperation of those responsible for the strategy by formal communications, seminar, action plans, and adjustments to budgets. So, after the implementation of the strategy and allocation of the responsibilities, we are now going to the um, we are now on the implementation and monitoring suggested control. So, the chosen strategy again may require the implementation of new controls or the modification of existing controls. Businesses are dynamic, and the controls that are in place will need to be monitored to assess whether or not they are succeeding in their objectives. So, the risk management group should be empowered to monitor the effectiveness of the actions being taken in each specific area, as this can be affected by internal and external factors. such as changes in the marketplace or the introduction of new computer systems. So, next step is review and refine and do it again. So, all of the elements outlined in the slides are form a part of an iterative cycle where risk management is continually reviewed and developed. As the cycle continues, risk management should increasingly become embedded in the organization so that it really becomes part of everyone's job. Next step is, or under the review and refine and do it again step, is to is the information for the decision making. So under this, since it will be doing again, or it we will redo again, there is an information for decision making or decision making stage. So risk management should form a key part of the organization decision making process. Information is gathered at all stages of the risk management cycle, and this information should be fed into the decision making mechanisms. So, to end this discussion on my part, I will be giving a summary. So, there are risks in most situations, which is risk management is an important element of corporate governance, and every organization should review their risk status and develop their approach as described in the CIMA risk management cycle. Managing risk of fraud is the same in principle of managing any other business risk. So,